Part 1. The Man Who Painted the Breath of the Wind. It begins not in a crowded Paris café, not in the smoky salons of the Impressionists, but on a small Caribbean island where the sea was the only clock, and the wind carried secrets from shore to shore. They say Camille Pissarro could hear colors before he could paint them. As a boy, he'd sit for hours on a weathered dock in Charlotte-Amalie, watching sails vanish into the horizon, and in his mind those sails were not white, but trembling with pink, gold, and violet, each hue whispering of lands he had yet to see. But there was another truth about Pissarro's childhood, a truth he would never quite escape. He did not belong. Born in 1830 to a French-Jewish father and a mother of Creole descent, Camille grew up in a place where identities were worn like masks. Colonial society was rigid, gossip was a currency, and those who didn't fit neatly into its social hierarchy were left in the margins. From the very start, he understood what it meant to stand outside the frame. When other children played, he drew, crudely at first, on scraps of paper, on the backs of shipping invoices from his father's general store. His earliest sketches were of things that moved: carts clattering down cobbled streets, gulls lifting into the sky, women with baskets balancing on their hips. He was chasing something even then, the fleeting, the ungraspable. But art was not a career for the son of a merchant. At 12, Camille was sent away to school in France. It was here, in a grey classroom overlooking the Seine, that a quiet seed of rebellion began to grow. One rainy afternoon, his art master, Monsieur Savary, leaned over Camille's shoulder as the boy sketched the twisted branches of a chestnut tree outside. Savary didn't speak for a moment, then murmured, "You draw what you see. But one day, you must learn to draw what you feel." That sentence would follow Pissarro like a ghost. By 17 he had returned to St. Thomas, dutifully working in his father's store, selling bolts of cloth and sacks of grain. But every evening after the shutters were drawn, Camille would take out his sketchbook and paint the day from memory. Sunsets melting into the harbor, women bent in labor over fishing nets, children running barefoot through puddles after a sudden rain. The more he painted, the more unbearable the store became. The ticking of the wall clock felt like chains tightening around his ribs. And then came the choice that would change everything. In 1852, Camille met the Danish painter Fritz Melby, who had docked his ship in St. Thomas. Melby's stories were like open windows to another life: Paris, Caracas, the jungles of Venezuela. One night, standing on the dock, Melby said simply, "Come with me." The next morning, Pissarro left the island without a word to anyone except his mother. He carried only a trunk of clothes, his paints, and the burning need to prove, to himself, to the world, that he was more than the boy in the back of the store. Part 2. The Baptism of Paris. Paris, 1855. The city was a living, breathing canvas, the Seine coiling like a ribbon of mercury through its heart, the streets alive with the clatter of carriage wheels and the distant hum of café conversations. Camille Pissarro stepped off the train into a place that felt both infinite and merciless. He had never seen buildings so tall, lights so bright, or people moving with such purpose. The air smelled of coal smoke, bread ovens, and paint, always paint, from 100 cramped studios hidden behind weathered doors. He found a room in a boarding house near Montmartre, just wide enough for a bed, an easel, and a crate that doubled as a table. The plaster walls were cracked, the window drafty, but to Pissarro it felt like a cathedral. Here, at last, there was space to paint without glancing over his shoulder for customers. Every morning he'd rise before dawn and walk to the banks of the Seine, watching how fog swallowed the bridges, how the first light struck the gilded tip of Notre Dame. He painted in the open air, his fingers stiff from cold, his canvases damp with mist. But the city had rules. The official salon, the great gatekeeper of the French art world, looked upon newcomers with disdain. The works that hung in its gilded halls were smooth, perfect, and heavy with historical grandeur. Greek gods, biblical epics, kings astride white horses. Pissarro's paintings? Mud paths winding between cottages. Women bent over vegetable gardens. Laundry flapping on a windy afternoon. The jury barely glanced before rejecting them. Still he painted. He haunted the Louvre, not to admire the pomp of the masters, but to study their brushwork like a thief casing a vault. He found himself drawn not to the polished portraits of nobility, but to the small, forgotten landscapes, moments where the artist's hand seemed to breathe instead of dictate. It was in these years that Pissarro began to meet others who, like him, were restless in the shadow of the salon. Claude Monet with his quicksilver energy. Pierre-Auguste Renoir with a laugh as loud as a tavern. Paul Cézanne, volcanic, intense, almost frightening in his devotion. They gathered in dim cafés, their pockets nearly empty, arguing about light, about truth, about whether a painting should be a mirror or a window. One winter evening, Monet leaned across the table, eyes blazing. "We must paint not what the world expects, but what the eye truly sees in the moment it sees it." For Pissarro it was like a match to dry tinder. They began painting together in the countryside outside Paris, chasing sunlight like hunters, watching how it shifted not just by the hour but by the minute. Pissarro's brushstrokes loosened, his colors deepened, greens that hummed with life, browns that smelled of soil, skies that seemed to move across the canvas. But with freedom came hunger. Their work sold rarely if at all. More than once, Pissarro had to choose between buying paints or buying food. He often painted over old canvases because he couldn't afford new ones. His boots wore thin, his coat threadbare. Still he painted. Then came the war. In 1870, the Franco-Prussian conflict swept across France like wildfire. Pissarro fled Paris with his family, leaving behind nearly 1,500 paintings stored in his home. When he returned after the war, only 40 remained, the rest destroyed, trampled, or used as rags by soldiers. It could have ended him. But standing in the ruins of his life's work, Camille Pissarro made a decision that would define him. If the world could erase his past, he would paint a future no one could destroy. Part 3. The Birth of a Revolution. Spring of 1873. The city had changed, but so had Pissarro. His beard had thickened, his eyes lined by years of squinting into sunlight, but the fire in them burned hotter than ever. Paris's art establishment still stood like an iron wall before him, but now he was not alone. Monet, Renoir, Sisley, Cézanne, they were no longer just friends, they were an army of outcasts. It was Pissarro who first whispered the impossible. "If they won't let us into their salon, let's make our own." It was more than rebellion, it was suicide in the eyes of many. To bypass the salon meant cutting oneself off from the only path to recognition, patronage, and survival. But to Pissarro it meant freedom. And so, in 1874, in the studio of photographer Nader, the first Impressionist exhibition opened its doors. No marble floors, no gilded frames, just bare walls, raw light, and canvases that seemed to pulse with air and movement. A critic walked in, sneered at Monet's impression, Sunrise, and wrote the word, Impressionism, in mockery. The name stuck, and so did the outrage. The press roasted them alive. The paintings look unfinished. A smear of colors by lunatics. Children could do better. Sales were pitiful. But something had shifted, they had planted a seed. For Pissarro the exhibitions were more than just a stage. They were a creed. He became the quiet center of the group, the one who mediated when Monet's vanity clashed with Cézanne's volcanic temper, the one who encouraged the shy Sisley, who defended Renoir when critics tore him apart. "Camille is our teacher," Cézanne once said. "Without him we would have all given up long ago." Yet even as the Impressionists began to find their place, Pissarro's own life was still a battlefield. He painted in winter fields until his fingers went numb, in muddy streets where carriage wheels splattered his canvases, in markets where the scent of onions and horses mixed with the sharp tang of turpentine. Each painting was a gamble. If it didn't sell, there was no rent, no bread. But he refused to paint for the market. He would not sweeten the truth of the world for the sake of a buyer's parlor. In the late 1880s, while some Impressionists softened their style to appeal to collectors, Pissarro did the opposite. He experimented, pushed, risked. His brushstrokes became tighter, his palette bolder, influenced by the new wave of pointillism from Georges Seurat and Paul Signac. Critics scoffed again. But Pissarro didn't care. He had never painted for applause. In those years he often returned to the countryside, not to escape the city, but to remember why he painted in the first place. The slow arc of the sun over a meadow. The rustle of wind through wheat. A farmer's stoop as she gathered vegetables at dusk. These were his cathedrals. And yet, the art world, the one he had fought to change, was slowly turning away from him. Younger painters were stealing the spotlight. Collectors preferred Monet's water lilies, Renoir's roses, Cézanne's mountains. Pissarro was still respected, even revered by his peers, but respect did not pay the bills. In letters to friends he confessed a truth he rarely spoke aloud. "I'm tired. But I will paint until my hands can no longer hold a brush." Part 4. The Last Light. Winter came hard in the 1890s. Paris was a city of electric lights and new boulevards now, but in Pissarro's studio, the light still came from the great window, the same pale, shifting sky he had chased his entire life. By then age had left its mark. His beard was a snowy white, his hands swollen from rheumatism. Walking long distances to paint outdoors became agony, but to stop was unthinkable. He wrote to his son Lucien, When I no longer feel the urge to paint, I will know I am already dead. But there was a cruel twist. His eyes began to betray him. An infection in his tear ducts meant he could no longer work in the cold or wind. The man who had once stood knee-deep in snow to capture a winter's glow was now forced to paint from behind glass. He rented rooms overlooking city squares, markets, and river quays, setting up his easel at the window. He painted through rain-streaked panes, through the blurred shimmer of glass. The outside world became a stage and he its quiet observer. The canvases of those years, Boulevard Montmartre, the Garden of the Tuileries, carried a strange new quality. Still full of life, but tinged with a melancholy distance, as if the painter himself stood forever at the edge of the scene, unable to step in. Friends noticed the change in him. He was still gentle, still encouraging to younger artists, but there was a wistfulness in his voice. The battles of his youth, the rejection, the ridicule, the fight to make Impressionism a force in the world, were over. The movement was celebrated now, collected by museums. But the price had been decades of struggle, poverty, and obscurity. One evening as he packed away his brushes, he murmured to Lucien, "They will call us masters now. But where were they when we starved?" And yet there was no bitterness in his final years. Only a quiet acceptance. He had painted the truth as he saw it, the rhythm of life in all its ordinariness and beauty, and perhaps that was enough. In late 1903, bedridden with illness, Pissarro still spoke of light. "I can see it," he whispered. Soft, like the first morning of the world. On November 13, 1903, the man who had been called the father of Impressionism was gone. At his funeral, Monet stood in silence for a long time, then said simply, "He was one of us, the best of us." Epilogue: The light that never fades. Long after Camille Pissarro was lowered into the cold November earth, the streets and fields he painted kept changing. The markets filled with new voices, the trees grew and fell, the rivers swelled and shrank with the seasons. The people in his paintings, the washerwomen, the farmers, the quiet walkers, were gone. And yet they still breathed on canvas. In museums his works glowed like windows to another time. Children pressed their faces close, as if they might step through into the warm haze of a harvest afternoon or the gentle chaos of a Paris boulevard. Scholars spoke of brushstrokes, of composition, of historical importance. But ordinary people, they just felt something. Because Pissarro had never painted for fame or money or history. He painted for the simple miracle of seeing. Every dawn, every shadow stretching across a cobblestone, every face lit by the flicker of market lanterns, he knew they would vanish in moments. So he caught them. Not to stop time but to honor it. And somewhere, perhaps, the old painter's spirit still sits by a high window, brush in hand, watching the light shift across the world. The light he knew could never truly be owned, only borrowed for an instant, and given back for all of us to share. Camille Pissarro is gone. But the light he loved, his light, still shines.